one word, Atlantis, an ancient dream of a lost continent, which techniques and culture are said to have reached mythical dimensions, undiscovered up to date, but nevertheless, it is there, it exists. It is even shown on old maps, but it would be useless to ask traveling offices for any information about it. But it exists in thousands of years in the history of the world, and we know that these tenacious human dreams are always realized sooner or later. Troy was found, the Egyptian and Phoenician homes of culture were discovered, Atlantis will also be found. When I made the statement that Atlantis was not submerged in the ocean, but lost in the arid tracts of the southern Sahara, it would appear to be an actual fact. I mentioned to you the number of caravans, aeroplanes, and persons who have disappeared in the Sahara without any trace whatever. I also told you that even today there are oases and villages in the desert which no Europeans have visited, or at least never left again alive. What would happen if the site of the lost Atlantis were known to the natives? If it today serves them as a secret stronghold? If it is not lying at the bottom of the sea, but just under the sands of the Sahara, covered, devoured by sand, and the natives build their houses upon it?
What's the matter?
That man is right.
Huh?
Perfectly right. Atlantis is covered by the sands of the Sahara.
Well, how do you know?
Because I've been there. I have seen Atlantis.
Seen it? You're rather exaggerating, aren't you?
The story of Atlantis comes to us from the Greek philosopher Plato, who wrote of it in his Timaeus and Critias dialogues during the 4th century BC. Many scholars argue that Plato's account of Atlantis was a purely fictional tale designed to teach lessons related to a model society. The idea that Plato's story of Atlantis is purely fictional has been floating around since ancient Greece. Sometime between 64 BC and 24 AD, the Greek philosopher, historian, and geographer Strabo wrote about a harsh critic of Plato's dialogues made by the Greek politician Posidonius. He wrote, "He did well, too, in citing the opinion of Plato that the tradition concerning the island of Atlantis might be received as something more than a mere fiction, it having been related by Solon, on the authority of the Egyptian priests, that this island, almost as large as a continent, was formerly in existence, although now it had disappeared." Posidonius thinks it better to quote this than to say, "He who brought it into existence can also cause it to disappear, as the poet did the wall of the Achivi." Basically, Posidonius accused Plato of conveniently destroying Atlantis in his dialogues in order to explain away the lack of evidence supporting its existence. Strabo adds the commentary that Homer did much the same thing when he destroyed the Achaean wall with a Poseidon-induced flood in his Iliad. This suggested to many that the city of Troy was fiction and did not exist, until it was found much later by Heinrich Schliemann in 1870. But in Plato's dialogues, the character Critias states that the tale of Atlantis is true. Then listen, Socrates, to a tale which, though strange, is certainly true, having been attested by Solon, who was the wisest of the 7 sages. Plato's character of Socrates supported the notion that the story is true. And what other Critias can we find that will be better than this, which is natural and suitable to the festival of the goddess, and has the very great advantage of being a fact and not a fiction? But this is not enough for many researchers. So how can we know for certain if the story of Atlantis is genuine history or mere legend? Perhaps we don't need to. Many Atlantis researchers and scholars prefer to take Plato's written words at face value verbatim. But there may be a middle ground between myth and reality. And surprisingly, Plato tells us about that middle ground right in his dialogues. The Critias character states, "All that is said by any of us can only be imitation and representation. For if we consider the likenesses which painters make of bodies divine and heavenly, and the different degrees of gratification which the eye of the spectator receives them, we shall see that we are satisfied with the artist who is able in any degree to imitate the earth and its mountains, and the rivers, and the woods, and the universe, and the things that are and move therein. And further, that knowing nothing precise about such matters, we do not examine or analyze the painting. All that is required is a sort of indistinct and deceptive mode of shadowing them forth. But when a person endeavors to paint the human form, we are quick at finding out defects, and our familiar knowledge makes us severe judges of anyone who does not render every point of similarity. And we may observe the same thing to happen in discourse. We are satisfied with a picture of divine and heavenly things, which has very little likeness to them. But we are more precise in our criticism of mortal and human things. Wherefore, if at the moment of speaking I cannot suitably express my meaning, you must excuse me, considering that to form approved likenesses of human things is the reverse of easy." So through the character of Critias, Plato is telling us that whatever they discuss can only be an approximation of the real thing. And he gets more specific. "I ought to warn you that you must not be surprised if you should perhaps hear Hellenic names given to foreigners. I will tell you the reason of this. Solon, who was intending to use the tale for his poem, inquired into the meaning of the names and found that the early Egyptians, in writing them down, had translated them into their own language. And he recovered the meaning of the several names, and when copying them out again, translated them into our language. My great-grandfather, Dropides, had the original writing, which is still in my possession, and was carefully studied by me when I was a child. Therefore, if you hear names such as are used in this country, you must not be surprised, for I have told how they have came to be introduced." So through the character of Critias, Plato is telling the reader point blank that certain elements in this dialogue have been altered, such as the names of people, places, and things, in order to make this Egyptian story more palatable to a Greek audience. Critias then says later, "I have described the city and the environs of the ancient palace nearly in the words of Solon." In other words, Critias admits to describing the city of Atlantis nearly as Solon did, but not exactly. And we can find support for this notion outside of Plato's dialogues. Plutarch's Lives is a series of 45 biographies of notable persons written by Plutarch. In his biography of the Athenian lawgiver Solon, he wrote, "Plato, willing to improve the story of the Atlantic island as if it were a fair estate that wanted an heir and came with some title to him, formed, indeed, stately entrances, noble enclosures, large courts, such as never yet introduced any story, fable, or poetic fiction, but, beginning it late, ended his life before his work, and the reader's regret for the unfinished part is greater, as the satisfaction he takes in that which is complete is extraordinary. For as the city of Athens left only the temple of Jupiter Olympus unfinished, so Plato, amongst all his excellent works, left this only piece about the Atlantic island imperfect." What Plutarch is outright telling his readers here is that Plato embellished the story that came to him from Solon. Some researchers feel that Plato, being the sole source for the legend of Atlantis, indicates that he must have fabricated the story for his allegory, but that isn't entirely accurate. In Book 3 of the Library of History by Greek historian Diodorus Siculus, the author wrote sometime between 80 and 20 BC, "Such, then, are the myths which are told about Mother of Gods, both among the Phrygians and by the Atlanteans who dwell on the coast of the ocean. After the death of Hyperion, the myth relates, the kingdom was divided among the sons of Uranus, the most renowned of whom were Atlas and Cronus. Of these sons, Atlas received as his part the regions on the coast of the ocean, and he not only gave the name of Atlanteans to his peoples, but likewise called the greatest mountain in the land Atlas. In fact, Atlantis appears in a poem written by the ancient Greek historian Hellanicus of Lesbos, sometime between 490 to 405 BC. Remember that Plato lived from 427 to 347 BC. Given that Plato wrote his dialogues towards the end of his life, the poem written by Hellanicus would precede Plato's dialogues. That in turn means that the idea of Atlantis also precedes Plato. But not only does Hellanicus mention the fabled city of Atlantis in his poem, he also mentions the creator of Atlantis, Poseidon, the first king of Atlantis, Atlas, and the daughters of Atlas, the seven sisters, also known as the Pleiades. Ancient Greek philosopher Proclus Lysias wrote extensively about Plato's dialogues and makes mention of multiple historians that discuss the topic of Atlantis in his commentaries on the Timaeus of Plato. That such and so great an island once existed is evident from what is said by certain historians respecting what pertains to the external sea. For according to them, there were 7 islands in that sea, in their times sacred to Proserpine, and also 3 others of an immense extent, one of which was sacred to Pluto, another to Ammon, and the middle of these to Neptune, the magnitude of which was 1,000 stadia. So we can't use Plato's dialogues as an absolute and exact guidebook for Atlantis, but we can use it as a collection of clues, particularly when compared with other ancient catastrophe myths from cultures around the world.